Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at CPU overclocking on Gigabyte X3, well, Gigabyte AM4 motherboards, the mid-range to the low-end stuff. So this right here is the X370 Gaming K5. That's the board I'll be doing this on, and basically everything I do on this motherboard should apply down through the Gigabyte product stack to all the way down to like the B350 Gaming. One mistake that a lot of people make about this board right here, which this is the Gaming K5. This is a very different board from the Gigabyte X370 Gaming 5. I know that doesn't make a ton of sense because it's a literal, like, it's a one-letter difference in the name, but the K5 is a 4 plus 3-phase VRM and has a clock gen. The Gaming 5, without the K, doesn't have the clock gen and has a 6 plus 4 phase VRM. So the Gaming 5 is much closer to the Gaming K7 in terms of VRM and actual voltage control options and all of the sort of CPU voltage stuff, basically, because very different VRM, completely different voltage controller, different phase count, different MOSFETs, different everything. Similar heatsinks and similar aesthetic, but completely different electrically. On the other hand, the X370 Gaming K5 that we have here is similar to the X370 Gaming K3. And basically the K3 is this board minus a few features and some of the aesthetic things. The K3 still has the clock gen, and it still has the same 4 plus 3 phase VRM that we have here. Then there's the X370 Gaming, that's still the same VRM. It loses the clock gen and has different VRM heatsinks. Then there's the B350 Gaming 3, that's no clock gen, same heatsinks, B350 chipset instead of X370. Well, different heatsinks, but same VRM, different chipset. B350M Gaming 3, that's an MATX board, same VRM, different heatsinks, no clock gen. You get the idea. And then we have the B350 Gaming, which is like the last board that I think will match this board in terms of, VRM design is the same, different heat sinks again, and should be pretty similar BIOS-wise. So if you have any of these boards, it should apply to you. Obviously, if you have the K5 or the K3, this will be much closer to your experience. Like, what I do here will be much closer to what you will be dealing with than I think any of the other boards, but they shouldn't be all that different since they are all the same VRM, and I can't imagine Gigabyte bothering with redesigning the VRM when they haven't really bothered with redesigning the power circuits. Actually, I meant redesigning the BIOS when they haven't redesigned the power, or like the VRM. So yeah, that's that. So anyway, let's get this started up. I've wiped the BIOS, as you're about to see. I'm just going to put you onto the monitor capture, and let's get going. In terms of actual hardware, I'm using a 240mm AIO cooler, the Arctic thingy. Can't remember the name. Actually, we should go over that. But so you can see the BIOS opened up. We are at stock settings right now, so everything's auto. Right? Yeah, good. But let's just quickly go over what we have actually on the motherboard. The power supply here is a 1200 watt Antec HCP 1200. So massively overkill power supply, and basically idle efficiency on the system because of that is terrible. I have this multimeter right here. This is hooked directly behind the CPU socket for voltage measurement, so that's very it's really accurate. The cooling is a 240mm, AIO. It has two 120mm fans doing, I think, 2000 RPM. This is plenty of cooling for pretty much any Ryzen overclock on this open air setup. If this was inside a case, like, ultimately it depends on what cooling you have, right? I'm not saying go buy this, but depending on what cooling you have, just make sure that the temperatures are in check. We'll talk about that later when we actually get into Windows and start looking at monitoring stuff. The memory, I'm using T-Force Extreme 3733 CL18 memory kit from Team Group. This is Samsung B-Die. We will not be looking into memory overclocking today. We're just going to leave that completely alone, because that is just like way more information that we'd need to cover, and that would take forever. So let's get right into the CPU overclocking stuff right here. Starting with which I need to switch you back to the monitor now. So we're in the BIOS. All of your overclocking settings are found here in the MIT section of the BIOS, and this BIOS does have an easy easy mode, but we're not going to go into it because it's kind of useless. So once you're in your advanced mode, you're going to go to MIT Advanced Frequency Settings. You're not going to touch the easy overclock tuner. This right here is your BCLK. So that's what the external clock gen is for. And basically this is really handy when you're like dialing in border, like when you really want to squeeze the last little bit out of your memory or your CPU or both at the same time. So it's really good for like dialing in very fine adjustments, but we're not going to be looking at memory overclocking. And for most motherboards, like the only other board that this has this is the gaming K3. So the K5 and the K3 have this option in the BIOS. All the other motherboards from Gigabyte that I've said this guide will apply to don't have this option. We won't be using it because we're just going to look at CPU overclocking, and with Ryzen having you know, the fractional multipliers that go down to 1/4 of a gigahertz, so you can adjust CPU frequency by 250 megahertz, there's really no point in worrying about BCLK overclocking for just CPU stuff. Anyway, we're going to go into the advanced CPU core settings, and we're going to disable that, we're going to disable that, and we're going to leave global C states enabled. We're going to leave C states enabled because if you disable these, the voltage for the CPU will stop going down for idle. So yeah, and I tried this, and if you disable C states and you try to do like P state overclocking, it still doesn't, like, your voltage stays really high at idle. Ultimately, this board and basically all the other Gigabyte boards that this guide will apply to do not have P-state overclocking unless you use like a hacked BIOS, and honestly, I don't see the point. If you disable your C states, your idle power consumption will be like 20 watts higher. Well, not even, yeah, roughly 20 watts higher than if you didn't actually overclock at all. And your load power consumption doesn't change. So just leave C states enabled and don't worry about anything else. There's really no need to mess around with any more advanced, you know, power, like the P states or anything like that. It doesn't say, it makes everything a lot harder, and it doesn't save you any power. Well, it saves you like 10 watts at idle, so great job there. Either way, we are just going to set, you know, disable these three, leave C states alone. And one more thing we're going to do is we're going to change the CPU core clock to anything but stock. So we're going to set it to 31 right now. And we're going to save and reset at this point. There's a very good reason for this. Gonna wait for the board to come back. In terms of actual like troubleshooting options, you have LEDs down here on this board. And basically there's an LED indicating VGA, DRAM, CPU, and boot. So VGA, when the VGA LED lights up, that's when the GPU tries to initialize. When the CPU LED lights up, that's the CPU trying to initialize. The DRAM LED is the memory trying to initialize. Obviously, a postcode would give you more detail, and luckily on Ryzen, you don't really need more detail. It's your RAM either works or it doesn't work. Your CPU either works or it doesn't work, or your GPU either initializes or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you have a problem. If it does, well, you know, not an issue. So we're back in the BIOS now. And we're going to go to advanced voltage settings. And this is going to annoy a lot of people because you'll notice that right off the bat we have dynamic vCore and dynamic vCore SoC. We don't have fixed offset voltages. This causes a few issues with this motherboard. First of all, it will not hold steady voltage at all. In fact, because basically what happens with the Ryzen 8 core and like the 6 cores and the 4 cores is the CPU will droop its vid going under full load. And the issue with that is that because this board applies its overvoltage by basically taking the vid and adding a offset voltage to that, when you go under load on, well, in my testing, when I had the 1700 that we have here, when I had the 1700 in 8-core mode, it would go from, say, 1.43 volts at idle down to 1.37 volts at full load. So you lose about 60 millivolts of voltage going from idle to full load. That does limit your maximum overclock a bit. It really shouldn't be, like, it won't cost you that many megahertz anyway, because around, like, you know, obviously if the board didn't drop that much voltage, you could maybe run 3.95 gigahertz instead of 3.9, but it's 50, it's 500 megahertz. It's not the biggest disaster ever. And if you have one of these boards, well, you're not going to run out and buy another motherboard just because this one drops a bit of voltage. So that's something you do have to deal with. There is no LLC to get rid of this. And ultimately, the board doesn't even need, it doesn't need a LLC setting. It needs a static voltage option because the board does compensate for it compensates for V drop just fine. The VRM will pump up will output higher voltage when you go under load. It's just the CPU requests less voltage, so you get less voltage. And then the VCore SoC we won't be looking at that voltage until we do the memory overclocking video, which is coming soon, I hope. But before we do anything to the core voltage here, we're going to go into the PC health status right here, and you can see that our VCore is 1.176, and if we wait for it, it should go back up to like 1.188, and sometimes it'll dip down to 1164. So basically, this is our base, there we go, this is our base core voltage, right? This is the voltage that you're adding your offset to. I think if you have a 1700X or an 1800X, this voltage may be higher, but on a 1700, it's 1.17, 1.18 range-ish. So basically, if you want to set your core voltage, say you want to have 1.38 volts at idle, you'd set 0.2 offset in terms of voltage. Now, in terms of actual safe voltage range, max safe voltage for Ryzen is anything between 1.45 and 1.42 volts. So basically, we're just going to go straight for 0.25. Well, no, this is not an MSI board. 258. There. So we're going to go for that voltage. Right off the bat, because that'll give us 1.43 volts at idle and about 1.37 volts at full load. If you're on a 6-core, you'll actually be getting closer to, you'll be, instead of like 1.37, you'll be at like 1.39. And if you're on a quad-core, you'll actually be around 1.4. So if you're on a quad-core and a 6-core, the voltage really doesn't dip down as much as on the 8-core. So that's nice. If you're on a 6-core, you'll actually clock higher with this motherboard than if you're on an 8-core, just because of the voltage dipping down like that. So we'll just set that. And my overclocking procedure is just start with like the highest safe voltage for the CPU. And then we're going to work it down you're going to work it down depending on if you're overheating or not. Later on. Now, the cooling system I have here is actually like completely overkill. There's no way the CPU is going to exceed 80 degrees centigrade, but if you're on like a weaker air cooler, like say the stock cooler or a Hyper 212 Evo or something more, something that isn't as ridiculous, isn't a 240 millimeter AIO like I have here, or you have really high ambient temperatures, or your case has terrible airflow, or for whatever reason your cooling is less good than what I'm dealing with here, you just watch the temperatures. If the temperatures are too high, you dial down the voltage. So, but initially, I like to start at really high voltage. Now, you may notice we're not actually getting 1.43 volts right now. That's because we're in the BIOS, and the BIOS is not the same as idling in Windows. The BIOS actually pulls a significantly higher amount of voltage than Windows does, and if we actually go into the PC, well, a significantly higher amount of power than the Windows does at idle. So we're getting a little bit of droop right now. But as you can see, the PC health status claims that we're at 1.43 volts. And unfortunately, this motherboard doesn't have a single good voltage sensor on it, which really sucks. But yeah, it's just, you're going to have to deal with that. Basically, don't exceed plus 200 and like that. Because if you exceed that, you're going to be above like 1.44 volts idle. And if your CPU is above 1.45 idle, it will degrade rather rapidly. It will start to degrade at accelerated rates. So in like a year or something, you might find out that, oh, your CPU can't hold the overclock anymore. I'm just going to stick to 0.258 because I personally prefer the lower margin of 1.42 volts max instead of the 1.45, so I'm going to stay closer to that. And, well, now we start overclocking, and let's just start it right at 40, because ultimately, if it crashes, no big deal. If it doesn't crash, great. Oh, that's fun. The capture card seems to have a... Okay, wait. I'll just have to unplug and plug the HDMI back in. There. And yeah, we're back. So now if we go into CPU-Z, and you can see the voltage dips down, way down right now. Like we're at 0.7 volts. And that's because we left the C states on. So the CPU is dynamically voltaging itself just fine, and you don't waste a ton of power. Now, if you are having some like weird stability issues, like initially I would actually recommend you try doing all of your overclocking without turning on C states. And after you dial in your after you think you're pretty happy with the stability, turn C states on and then do your final stress test. Because if C states, like from my perspective, if the C states cost you stability, then don't run them enabled. But I've not seen anything to indicate that the C states on this motherboard are an issue. Like having them enabled, it hasn't given me any problems in testing so far, so I'm just going to leave them enabled right now. But, you know, your mileage may vary, so I would recommend you start with C states disabled. But if you do leave your C states on, you do get the low idle voltage. We can see the CPU is at 4 gigahertz, and we're just going to quickly run Cinebench 64 here, and we're also going to open up, where is it, hardware info, and you're going to want to download hardware info. I'm going to leave a link to it down in the description. It is the best monitoring utility for Ryzen. It does pretty much everything you need. So you can see your vid voltages right here. You can see your CPU clock. We don't really care about that. What you're really looking for here is the CPU temperature. And for this motherboard, and actually all of these motherboards that I listed at the start of the video, you're going to want to watch this temperature right here. VRM MOS refers to this VRM heatsink up here, which is your CPU vCore heatsink. So that's your 4-phase vCore VRM under that. That VRM, if it hits over 125 degrees, will shut down the entire motherboard. In terms of safe operating temperatures, I agree with Gigabyte. Anything under 125 degrees is perfectly safe for the MOSFETs. Your capacitors around the VRM will really not appreciate those kinds of temperatures. However, the capacitors are so far away and the MOSFETs are so, like, they're not particularly good at transferring their heat into their surroundings, which is why they get so hot. The capacitors actually say a significant, like there's a significant temperature difference between the MOSFETs and the capacitors. So as long as your MOSFETs aren't really like going into the 120, like as long as you stay below 120, your capacitors should be fine as long as you have decent airflow around the CPU socket area. So like if you have a top-down air cooler, you should be golden. If you have an AIO or some kind of, you know, weird situation airflow-wise, I mean, ultimately, you don't need to worry about your airflow, right? You're going to stress test, and if your VRM temperature goes way up, then you need to go fix it, right? It's really simple. Is the temperature too high? If it is, fix it. If it's not too high, you're fine. You don't have to worry about it. There's no point theorizing about fan position until you know that you actually need to fix your airflow, so that's kind of that. So you do have that VRM temperature readout right there, and I imagine all of the other boards I listed should have that, well, all the other motherboards I listed at the start of the video should have temperature readouts right here as well. CPU temperature readout is right here. You do not want the CPU temperature exceeding 80 degrees, really. Cooler is better. If the CPU gets too hot, your stability goes to, like, your stability gets worse, your power consumption increases, so the cooler the better. Personally, you know, Zen has a thermal TJ max temperature of 95 degrees centigrade, which is why I recommend staying under 80 for loading, like under load, because if you look at something like, say, Skylake or KB Lake, then those have a higher recommended max temperature. And the reason for that is that KB Lake and Skylake have a TJ max of 105 degrees. Right, so they can go 10 degrees hotter than Ryzen before even Intel starts worrying about throttling them. So, but once you start pumping more voltage into them, that extra temperature just cranks up the degradation rate. So basically, the cooler your system is, the higher the voltage you can theoretically run. Past a certain point, too much voltage is just going to kill everything anyway, regardless of how low your temperatures are. But basically, if you do want to run in that 1.4 volts range, you want the CPU to be as cool as possible. So anyway, we're actually not gonna, well, let's quickly do a quick run of Cinebench. So you can see the voltage just dives right off the bat. And if we look for any voltage readouts, like this is reading absolute garbage, that's way off, right? That's saying 1.428. That's completely wrong. This is 1.38. If we look around, you can, yeah, the voltage reading is just completely off. There's not a single voltage readout anywhere. Not even like CPU-Z actually will do it properly if we run again. Right, CPU-Z is actually reading, yeah, it's just reading that same sensor that you're seeing here. So that's the same sensor as CPU-Z is reading, and that sensor is just way off. So software voltage readings on this motherboard are just non-existent, and the entire series of motherboards just doesn't read software voltage properly. But nonetheless, that's not going to stop us. So Cinebench runs fine, and I just wanted to demonstrate the voltage drop. We're not going to save that score. We're going to run a proper stress test in the form of Intel burn test. You'll also notice that our VRM temperature, just during that quick testing right there, went all the way up to 65 degrees centigrade, and that's even with the fan sitting on the VRM, so it does get pretty hot. I'm just going to set it to high load because the more memory you give Intel burn test to use, the longer it cycles and the longer it takes to, and there you saw it. Dropped all the way below 1.38 volts and the system instantaneously crashed. So that tells us that 4 gigahertz is way too damn high because the VRM temperature was still okay. And this board, so this is convenient that it's doing this. This board has, like Ryzen officially should have a system where after 3 failed posts, it soft reset, resets the BIOS. This motherboard doesn't do that. This motherboard will happily boot loop on you, and we got into Windows. So if you crash, you're going to want to hit the reset button after a crash in order to get into the BIOS. Otherwise, this thing will just sit there boot looping. If the VRM trips over temperature protection, the motherboard will get stuck boot looping. A whole bunch of issues will cause this motherboard to just boot loop. So yeah, keep that in mind. You can't rely on this thing to restart on you properly. And for some reason, the keyboard decided it won't initialize. So try one more time. Keyboard, please. Okay, that's interesting. Try shut it down, just, you know, give it a cold start instead of just resets. Hopefully it'll work. Okay, no, it's decided that it doesn't like the keyboard anymore, which is fun. Well, looks like... Why can nothing ever work? Mouse came on. Still no keyboard. Whatever. I'll just pull the USB sticks out of it and move the keyboard to a different port. Okay, there we go. Should work now. So yeah, you can see the BIOS hasn't reset or anything, and at this point we're just gonna drop the CPU frequency a bit and try run Intel burn test again. I already know this is gonna crash, so but basically, as long as your CPU temperatures are in check and your VRM temperatures are in check, you set the voltage at the start as high as possible, and then you just lower the CPU clock until you stop crashing in your stress tests. If you do have VRM temperature problems and you can't fix them by applying more airflow to the VRM, or you just don't like the noise output or something like that, you should... really, like, or your cooler is just not good enough for, you know, the core voltage that you end up with under load. You basically are going to have to, what was it? well, lower the core voltage, right? Lower the offset voltage that you have. And yeah, here you can see why the, the board doesn't hold core voltage properly. The vid just falls off a cliff, because ultimately the board does do its offset voltage off of the vid, and the vid just changes depending on the load and how many cores your CPU has. Which this is a safety thing, from the perspective of the CPU. This is a safety thing. And we've managed to actually get through one loop of that. And we crashed again. But basically the fact that the board, like the CPU drops the vid is, that's a safety thing for, well, voltage regulation on the bare minimum design motherboards that like OEMs do and stuff. So that's why the vid drops. Unfortunately, this board really doesn't have like a static override voltage. If it had that, the VRM out of the box voltage calibration seems to be actually like pretty spot on, you know, because basically the entire drop in voltage that you get under full load is entirely down to the vid voltage changing. It's not to, like, the VRM is still hitting the exactly the voltage it's aiming for, pretty much. It's not a case of the VRM like, you know, CPU, basically the problem is CPU actually requests 1.37 volts under load. It's not the VRM not being able to hold 1.43, it's just CPU says, I want 1.37. So ultimately, Gigabyte could just patch this. They don't even need to add LLC settings, they can just give us static voltage mode. Anyway, we're going to have to lower the CPU frequency some more, and we're going to restart. And at this point, I know for a fact that it'll pass Intel burn test, but we're just going to run it for a bit so I can show you how the VRM temperatures warm up. And it does take a while for the VRM temperatures to get up to, well, get up to temperature, basically. Even on like this motherboard and the relatively anemic heatsink that it has, it takes something like takes like 4 minutes before the motherboard will shut down due to over temperature. So it takes a while for the VRM heatsink to heat up and the VRM to overheat. So, you know, it does take, like, you can't just, you know, quickly look at your VRM temperatures and go like, oh yeah, this is going to be good. And this card seems to just, well, sorry about 6 meters of HDMI cable. It's really not doing, it's doing quite the number on the HDMI card, on the capture card. But let's get hardware info opened up. And Intel burn test. And basically, you know, you just keep running your stress test and everything until the, like basically, there's really not that much to it, right? The CPU either crashes, you lower, CPU crashes, you lower frequency. CPU overheats, you lower voltage. So CPU exceeds 80, you lower the voltage. VRM overheats, you lower the voltage. If the lower voltage causes the CPU to crash in the stress test, you lower the frequency. Not rocket science. It's really rather simple to just do the CPU overclock. And in terms of stress testing, I like Intel burn test. If you want to do something, a lot of other people stick to like Prime 95. I can't really see a reason why to use that one. But if you have a hard time choosing your favorite stress test, just use all of them. And I personally usually go for like an hour of Intel burn test. And if it passes an hour of that and it doesn't crash while doing like video recording or something, then I consider that the system's stable. But a lot of other people out there, you know, they do like 24-hour stress tests, but ultimately it depends on how much you value your data integrity and time, right? Obviously, if you use your computer for rendering or something, then the more time you spend stress testing, the less time you're going to, well, the less you're less likely to run into that situation where you're doing your render and 24 hours in it crashes and your render's gone. So yeah, stress test depending on the use case. If you just play games or something, then I mean, you know, it sucks if you crash in the middle of a multiplayer match, but I personally wouldn't care that much. So really with the stress testing, it depends on how critical you consider the system stability to your uses. But yeah, so you can use like Intel Burn Test, Prime 95. There's also ROG Real Bench, which is a very realistic workload. There's IDA. There's a ton of stress testing utilities. Just use whatever makes you want. I like Intel Burn Test. Speaking of which, I forgot to start it. But yeah, at this point, it really shouldn't crash on me. You can see the CPU temperatures. If you have a water cooler especially, the CPU temperatures will take a while before they get up there because water has a really, even well, the water glycol mixture that you have in most AIOs, and if you have a water loop, then you just have straight water. Water takes forever to heat up. It has a really high heat capacity. So if you're stress testing, you need to run the stress test for a long time before the water cooling system saturates. Basically, you need the water temperature to stop rising. You need the water temperature to stabilize. Once the water temperature is stable, you know what your max CPU temperature is going to be. For air cooling systems, they hit max temperature pretty quick. So yeah, you ultimately want to, like, depends on what kind of stress testing scenario you want to do. Or we can see that the temperatures are perfectly fine because, again, it's a 240mm AIO with 2000 RPM fans. It really shouldn't be having an issue. You can see the VRM is climbing up and up and up, and I'm actually just going to disconnect the fan to show you what it looks like when the VRM hits over temperature protection, which is going to take a while. So you might want to speed up this part of the video, or like skip forward. Because there's actually, like, there's no way to get it to heat up faster than just let it sit like this with no airflow. Also, just worth noting, all of the, like, these current readings that like, hardware info picks up are just, they're completely unrealistic, because if you actually check how much power is going into the VRM, it doesn't, like it's not even remotely close to the amount of power that hardware info is measuring the CPU using, which I find kind of hilarious, but it's just, yeah, software sensors, completely bloody useless at the best of times. And one of the problems with IBT is that it actually load cycles, so every time it prints out a number, it actually drops in terms of intensity. But basically, after roughly 2 more loops, then it should crash. Actually, even just 1 more loop and a little bit after that, we should be seeing this crash. Well, while we're waiting for this to crash, I guess I'll mention some other things. Oh, well, my notes don't include any other things. We've gone over the voltages, you know, max safe voltage is 1.45 or 1.42, whichever recommendation you prefer. I say somewhere in between. I've gone over the voltage, you know, how to set the voltage. It's an offset, so deal with it on these boards. CPU temperature is good, VRM temperature is getting up there. It's going to take a while. 10, 12 more degrees to go. The thing is, the hotter the VRM gets, the faster the heatsink is dissipating heat. So it takes longer and longer for the temperature to rise the warmer it gets. But, yeah. What else? We've gone over voltages. Frequency and cooling, I think we've gone over as well. Like, I think we've covered those well enough. Don't let the CPU go over 80. Also, one thing to keep in mind with stress testing, if you're depending on your case airflow, running your GPU under full load and your CPU under full load at the same time will give you a very different thermal environment than running CPU at full load, GPU turned like not idling. And I mean, that's not exactly rocket science, you know, that's not some riveting new discovery, but keep that in mind that if your GPU is one of those open air, open air coolers, it's gonna dump a lot of very hot air into your system. And if you have like a radiator, if your CPU water cooling radiator is top mounted exhaust or rear mounted exhaust, it's gonna pick up all of that very warm air from the GPU, and that's going to massively change what kind of CPU load temperatures you're going to get. So you want to, if you're stress testing the CPU, I recommend you also put some kind of heavy load on the GPU at the same time. Depending, like if you're streaming, for example, right? If you're streaming from the same system, which is like a perfect use case for a Ryzen 8 core, you do end up in that scenario where, you know, you're playing a game and you're encoding video with the CPU at the same time. And CPU video encoding is extremely heavy for the CPU, and playing a game is relatively heavy on the GPU, depending on, well, is very heavy on the GPU, depending on what game you play. And VRM should be shutting down anytime soon. But, you know, in that scenario where you're playing a game and streaming at the same time, you have all of this hot air from the GPU going into the CPU cooling system, and it'll actually change your CPU temperatures. And if your internal temperature of your case goes up by 10 degrees, your CPU temperature will go up by 10 degrees. So it is possible that if you just do a stress test where, you know, you just stress test the CPU alone, and then you go play a game while streaming at the same time, it is possible that your CPU will actually overheat in that scenario, because you suddenly have the you know, all of this extra hot air inside the case. So, you know, keep that in mind for use cases, because I see a lot of people, they just stress test the CPU and just forget that, hey, your GPU is going to cook your CPU alive, depending on how your air cooling system is set up, or water cooling system is set up. And generally, I think it's more of an issue with people mounting their radiators as exhaust, because the moment you have a radiator as exhaust, it's going to pick up all of the hot air used by the GPU. And the VRM's not shutting down yet. That's rather concerning, because I do have it written down that it shuts down around 125. Is it perhaps throttling the CPU? I mean, no, CPU is still running at full speed. I'm surprised that we haven't shut down yet, because we should be shutting down very soon. Unless, is there a problem with the sensor? No, the sensor's fine. How is it not shutting down yet? I love this. It's just like all the issues I had in the board with the board in testing is just like they're all gone now. It's reporting CPU frequency still maxed out, so I really don't get how we're still running here. Oh, no, we are actually, yeah, it is actually CPU throttling. I just completely missed it. Yeah, so if you, okay, that's the C states. That explains a lot, yeah. So if you have your C states enabled, right, your CPU will actually downclock to save itself. If you disable your C states, the VRM will shut you down. Still, don't let the VRM hit 120. Just don't. Like, this is just such a bad idea. If you have C states enabled, it will core clock throttle to save itself. If you don't have C states enabled, it will just, you know, shut down on you. So I really should have done more testing. It's like I'm never 100% certain that I've tested every possible scenario until I go and try to do one of these videos and everything just goes to hell. Anyway, I'm gonna re-enable the fan. I think the VRM has had more than enough of the abuse. And you can see immediately the VRM temperature starts just falling off a cliff. Well, falling off a cliff. Falling off a cliff rather slowly. But, yeah, the moment you turn a fan on, the VRM temperatures will come back down again. But, yeah, that is... if you have your C states disabled, it'll shut the board down. If you have your C states enabled, it'll start clock throttling on you. And at this point, I don't think there's anything left. Like, there's nothing left to mention because the system, like, this overclock right here that we're running, I know is stable for a fact. Like, I've run this overclock for, at this point, multiple hours, these voltage settings and this CPU clock, through IBT during testing. So, yeah, that's really all there is to overclocking on these Gigabyte motherboards. We'll just go quickly back through the BIOS. But before we go into the BIOS, keep an eye on your, VRM temperature. Make sure it doesn't go over 120. Keep an eye on your CPU temperature. Make sure it doesn't go over 80. And I do recommend that you do a stress test where you have both the CPU and GPU loaded up at the same time. I'm obviously not going to do it because we're on an open air test bench. These things don't, like, the GPU doesn't impact CPU temperature in this kind of environment. But if you are in a normal case or a case with really bad airflow or an ITX system, you have to test with the GPU loaded up because it will massively change the thermal characteristics. It'll impact VRM temperature, CPU temperature, all of that. So you do want to check that. Now that we're back in the BIOS, all you really need to do is disable, enable. Or disable, depending on, like, if C states give you issues, disable them. If C states don't give you issues, enable them. It saves you some power at idle. CPU clock ratio changes core, that changes your core clock. This, if you have a K3 or a K5, is the BCLK. You can use it to sort of fine-tune the core clock, but it's really not worth using it for that. It's really meant for... And I don't have numlock again, so it's real. Nope, wrong entry. There. But it's really meant for fine-tuning your memory clock more than your CPU clock. So keep that in mind, and we'll go over the details of the BCLK in another video. The voltage settings don't go over plus 270. Really, I would recommend that most people stay around plus 258. You can go also like significantly lower or significantly higher. Ultimately, well, actually, no, not significantly higher. You can go, if your cooling system's not up to it, then you can go lower, obviously. One thing I'm not sure about is if the 1700, like the X series CPUs, like a 1600X, 1700X, 1800X, 1500X, those chips might have a higher, vid voltage here. So if we go to frequency settings, I'm just going to quickly drop that back down. We save it like that. So just make sure you check your initial voltage before you start messing with the actual offsets, because that's what dictates your idle and load voltage afterwards. So this chip is, that 117, 118 range. Some other CPUs, I don't know. I think an 1800X might start at 1.3 volts, in which case plus 200 is 1.5, right? Plus 200 millivolts would be plus 1.5 volts. So just keep that in mind. If you have a X series CPU, just always check the initial voltage that you're offsetting from. Don't just apply an offset to a voltage you don't know what the initial is. So yeah, that I think that pretty much covers everything I want to cover here today. Thank you for watching. Thank you to alza.co.uk and to Gigabyte as well for providing the motherboard that I've been using here. I'm not really that disappointed in this board. I have rather low standards for motherboards. I don't plan to take on liquid nitrogen, so take that as you will. But ultimately, I don't think it's that bad. And if you have the B350 variants or the X37, like the other boards in this lineup, you can definitely overclock on them. If you have a 4-core or a 6-core, it should be a lot easier than on the 8-core because you'll be dealing with a lot less, voltage drop under load. V-droop, you'll be dealing with less V-droop and also less heat. So the VRM won't be getting as hot. But ultimately, even with an 8-core, you can make this work. You just need to be a little bit more mindful of your VRM temperature. Because if you aren't, then you're either gonna throttle because of the VRM overheating, which means you don't know actually if you're stable or not, or if you have the C states disabled, it'll actually just crash the system outright. So do keep that in mind. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below. If you have any questions or like that, you can leave those down as well. If you would like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, a PayPal, and there's also shirts you can buy. If there's anything you would like to see changed about this kind of like overclocking guide thing, because I don't know how to make guides. This is far too easy. Like I'm one of those people who literally goes overclocking out of boredom. So, it's just like when it comes to making guides, I'm just like, do I mention this? Do I not mention this? I don't know if I should mention this. I don't even know in which direction I normally work my CPU clocks, and it's usually from the top down. A lot of other people, they're like, oh yeah, you need to start low, but nah, just start really high. And if it crashes, you know it's never going to work. So that is it for the video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. For real this time.